What could be more terrible than becoming the first murderer in human history, to one who used his own hands to create a new concept called death? Perhaps only one thing: the choice to voluntarily step into the endless darkness with him. This story is not just about the crime that gave birth to violence, but also about an act of inexplicable compassion, an act that reshaped the very course of humanity from its dawn. It all began with a fracture, not a crack in the earth, but a fracture in the symphony of creation. The moment the stone in Cain's hand struck, it was not just a life that was extinguished, but a sacred harmony that was shattered. The air stood still, the wind ceased to blow, the sun seemed to stop radiating warmth, leaving only a cold, judgmental light that illuminated the spreading pool of blood, the first black ink stain on the white page of the world. Abel, the shepherd with the clear-sounding flute, had become eternal silence. Cain stood there amidst the deathly stillness and felt it. A severance, the invisible thread that connected him to all things, to the land, to the sky, to the very breath of the Creator, had been cut. In its place, something else was born within him, something more terrible than sign itself. It was the mark, not a scar for the world to see, but an internal transformation. His soul, once an instrument tuned to resonate with the universe, had now become a dissonant note, an eternal cacophony. From that moment on, he was cursed to forever hear the echo of his own deed, the sound of breaking bone, the final gasping breath, and, above all, the horrifying silence that followed. This was a torture more refined than any hellfire. He could still hear the birds sing, but he could no longer feel their joy. He could still see the flowers bloom, but he was no longer moved by their beauty. The mark had become a filter, stripping all color and meaning from life, leaving only a raw, gray reality. When he looked down at his hands, they were no longer the tools of a farmer who brought forth life from the soil. They had become weapons, a constant reminder of his own capacity for destruction. As night fell, hiding his crime from the light of day, a voice resounded in his mind, a voice whose power shook the very foundations of existence. "Where is Abel, your brother?" It was a question that sought not an answer, but repentance. A narrow door had been opened, an escape from the prison of guilty silence. But Cain, besieged by shame and wounded pride, chose to build another wall. "I do not know," he blurted out, his voice foreign and hollow. "Am I my brother's keeper?" A lie, the first lie to cover up a murder. It was worse than the crime itself, for it was rejection of the chance for redemption. As soon as those words were spoken, the fracture in creation became a chasm. The sky above him seemed to recede. The ground beneath his feet seemed to turn hostile. The curse needed no pronouncement. It had fulfilled itself. He had sentenced himself to an exile not just from his family and homeland, but from the very essence of joy and the sacred. His journey into the land of Nod began there, not with a footstep, but with a choice to slam his own soul shut. Cain's sentence was not carved in stone or written in fire. It was woven into the very fabric of his perception. The world was now seen through a gray filter of apathy. The sun still rose, but it was just a soulless orb of light, carrying no promise of a new beginning. The spring water still flowed, but it only quenched the thirst of his body, unable to wash away the stain on his soul. He ate to live, slept to forget, and woke to face the same familiar emptiness. The most brutal punishment was the loss of feeling. He, Cain, who had once felt life stir in every seed, who had understood the language of rain and wind, was now deaf to the melodies of nature. The land, his lover, and his mother had now become a cold stranger. Every time he touched it, it seemed to flinch. All his efforts to cultivate it ended in failure. The curse had been fulfilled. The ground would no longer yield its strength to him. This rejection was a severance, a constant reminder that he no longer belonged. But the physical punishment paled in comparison to the spiritual torment. The silence of God was an unbearable pressure. Before, even in solitude, he had felt an observation, a vast presence, an invisible connection. Now that connection was gone. Only a void remained. He could scream into the night, but his cries only dissolved into nothingness unanswered. This silence was not peace, it was abandonment. It was proof that he had gone too far, that he was lost in a place where even the Creator's light could not penetrate. In that emptiness, the mark in his soul grew stronger. The echo of his crime was no longer a memory. It was a living reality. He heard it in the whistling of the wind through the rocks, in the rustling of the leaves. It turned every sound of the world into an accusation. The laughter of a distant child sounded like a mockery. A joyful song sounded like an insult. He longed for absolute silence, but the only silence he could find was external. Inside, he was a relentless storm. This solitude and torment forged something new inside Cain. Not remorse, but a cold defiance. He began to see the world not as a garden to be tended, but as an enemy to be conquered. If he could not find harmony, he would impose order. If the divine world had abandoned him, he would build a kingdom of his own, a kingdom of man, with brick and mortar, with sweat and wool. A mad and audacious idea began to form, to create a refuge not from wild beasts, but from the silence of God, a fortress against the very meaninglessness of existence. He would no longer be a cursed wanderer. He would become a creator in his own right, a god in the small world of his own making. While Cain wrestled with his barren inner world, the first family's tragedy sowed a harvest of silence and sorrow. Adam and Eve had now tasted the two most terrible losses: expulsion from a perfect garden and the death of one child at the hand of another. Their pain was an abyss that separated them, each lost in a private realm of regret. Adam, with the burden of leadership, carried his grief like a silent stone. He worked more, spoke less, his eyes always gazing into the distance, as if trying to find answers in the empty horizons. Eve was different. Her grief was a flowing river. She wept for Abel, the gentle son, and she wept for Cain, the lost son. Her sorrow enveloped the family like a cold mist. Between them was Awan. Unlike her parents or brothers, Awan was born outside the Garden of Eden. Her memory was not of a perfect world lost, but of a reality that had always been filled with hardship, sweat, and thorns. A broken world was not a tragedy to her. It was the only home she had ever known. This gave her different eyes, a vision unobscured by nostalgia for a golden past. She saw the brokenness everywhere. She saw it in her mother's infinite sadness and her father's heavy silence, and she saw it most clearly in the tragedy of her two brothers. To others, the story was simple: a good man and a villain, a victim and a perpetrator. But Awan saw to lost souls. Abel was lost to the realm of the dead. But Cain, she realized, was lost to something worse, a death within life. She remembered Cain before the tragedy. He was not a monster. He was a man of the earth, strong, passionate, but also deeply insecure. She remembered the look in his eyes when his offering was rejected. just anger, but a profound hurt, a sense of rejection that had turned to poison. She did not excuse his action, but she understood the barren soul saw where the seed of violence had sprouted. His act was a crime, but his pain was also a truth. When Cain was exiled, Hawa felt her family was repeating the mistake of the garden. Once again, they were dealing with brokenness by cutting off and casting out. They were pushing a part of themselves into the darkness and pretending that doing so would keep the rest of them pure. But Awan knew that was impossible. A wound would not heal if one simply hid it away. She watched her brother lurking at the edge of the settlement, a ghost of himself, torn between shame and a longing to belong, while others saw a threat. Awan saw an unimaginable loneliness. A question began to echo in her mind, a question that went against all logic and safety. Does love end where justice begins? Does compassion have its limits? In Awan's eyes, the answer was no. She saw a world torn apart, and she refused to accept that the only way to survive was to cling to one piece and leave the other to the wolves. She felt an urge, not from reason, but from the depths of her heart, an urge to step across the chasm, not to save, but simply to accompany. A decision was taking shape, one that would redefine the meaning of loyalty and love in a world that was no longer perfect. Awan's choice was not made in a moment of impulse. It was forged in silence. During the long night she listened to her mother's weeping and felt the heaviness in her father's every step. It was a decision weighed not on the scales of logic, but on a deeper understanding of the nature of brokenness. On the evening of Cain's departure, Awan was ready. She carried only some dried food, a water skin, and a thick cloak against the night's chill. She stepped out of the family shelter, her small frame resolute, and faced her father, who stood like a silent judge, watching Cain prepare to step into the unknown. "Father," Awan said, her voice soft but unwavering, "I am going with him." Adam turned, his eyes wide with shock, which quickly turned to disapproval. "What are you saying, Awan? You cannot. He is cursed. His path is one of loneliness and misery. That is why I cannot let him walk it alone." Awan replied, "Our family has lost one son to death. We cannot lose another to despair. To send him out alone is another kind of killing, a killing of the last bit of humanity left in him." Cain, who had turned his back, froze in his tracks. He turned to look at his sister, unable to believe what he was hearing. For days he had grown accustomed to looks of fear, disgust, and judgment. But in Awan's eyes he saw none of that. He saw a profound sadness, and something else he dared not name, compassion. "Why?" Cain uttered, his voice hoarse from disuse. "I have nothing to offer you. The ground hates me. The sky is silent to me. To walk with me is to walk into nothingness." Awan stepped closer to him, crossing the safe distance her father had unconsciously created. "Then we will face the nothingness together," she said. "I am not going to forgive your sin, Cain. That is between you and God. I am going so that you do not have to bear the weight of your punishment alone. I am going because you are still my brother." This was a second fracture, but unlike the first, this one was not caused by violence, but by love, a fracture in the logic of punishment. Adam, the father, the patriarch, felt the foundations of his beliefs tremble. He had acted according to justice, according to what he believed was right. But his young daughter was acting according to a different law, a law older than sign itself, the law of connection. "You are choosing a life of hardship," Adam said, his voice having lost its firmness. "Now, only laced with pain. I am choosing family, one corrected him, however broken and twisted it has become. She turned to Cain, placing a hand on his arm. The light touch was like an electric current through Cain's calloused body, a human contact he thought he had lost forever. In the orange-red light of the setting sun, two figures stood side by side, a silent covenant formed. There were no oaths, no witnesses, but a stunned father and the darkening sky. It was a covenant that promised no future, guaranteed no salvation, but simply affirmed, I will be here. Awan had created for herself a new role in the human story, the companion of the exiled, the first candle lit in the darkness. The land of Nod did not greet them with hostility, but with absolute indifference. It was a primal landscape, a blank canvas holding no memory of a garden and bearing no mark of sin. Barren hills rolled on endlessly, and the sky seemed vaster and emptier. The wind here spoke a different language, not the whisper of creation, but the hollow hiss of emptiness. For Cain, this indifference was worse than punishment. It confirmed his own insignificance. In the old world, he had been the center of a cosmic tragedy. Here, he was merely a speck of dust, his existence changing nothing. The emptiness within him now had a perfect companion, the desolation without. He retreated deeper into silence, speaking only when necessary, each word an effort. Awan, in contrast, tried to learn the language of Nod. She did not look for familiar beauty, but learned to recognize a different kind, a beauty of resilience. She saw life in a stubborn shrub clinging to a rock face, and a small lizard darting under the harsh sun. She learned to distinguish the tracks of different animals, to find hidden sources of water, to identify the stars in Nod's sky, which seemed brighter, but also colder. Their journey was a dance of opposites. Cain walked ahead, his eyes fixed on the ground, as if fleeing from the sky. Awan followed, her eyes scanning everything, trying to weave a tapestry of meaning from the threads of the wilderness. She was their living memory. Every evening, as they lit a small fire, an island of warmth and an ocean of darkness, she would speak. She didn't tell happy stories, for there was no happiness to tell. Instead, she narrated their day. I saw an eagle today, she would say, her voice as soft as a lullaby. It flew so high it almost disappeared into the blue. Did you see it, Cain? Or the berries we found today were a bit sour, but they quenched the thirst. Perhaps we can find more tomorrow. At first, her words seemed to vanish into the air. Cain did not respond, but Awan persisted. She did not need him to answer. She just needed him to hear. She was using words to build a bridge, a fragile bridge across the abyss of silence that was enveloping him. She was reminding him that he was still alive, still experiencing, that the world was still happening around him, even if he had lost the ability to feel it. Gradually, a small miracle occurred. Her constant presence, her undemanding words began to penetrate Cain's calloused shell. He began to notice the things she pointed out. One day, when she almost stepped on a snake, it was he who pulled her back. Another time, when she had a fever, he sat watch over her all night, cooling her forehead with damp leaves. These were not acts of romantic love, but reflexes of a long-buried humanity being reawakened. Awan did not heal him. His wound was too deep, but she kept it from consuming him. She was his anchor in the storm. Her presence was a daily affirmation that he was not a complete monster, that even in the most sinful man, there was still a glimmer of the brother who once existed. In the land of Nod, the kingdom of indifference, Awan had become the language of care, a language Cain was slowly relearning how to understand. Wandering could not last forever. The body needed rest, and the soul, however broken, craved an anchor. It was Cain, in a moment of long-dormant decisiveness, who chose the place they would stop, a sheltered valley where a river snaked through, creating a patch of relative fertility. The act of stopping triggered a profound shift within him. The energy he had once poured into moving now needed a new outlet, and he found it in the act of building. It began simply, a low stone wall to block the wind from their cave, a crude pen to hold a few small animals they had captured. But then Cain discovered clay. He realized that when mixed with water and dried in the nod sun, it became incredibly hard, and when fired, it turned into brick, an artificial material, a product of will and intellect, not a gift of nature. This discovery was like a lightning strike to his mind. It gave him power, the power to reshape the world to his own design. Building became his obsession. He worked with a terrifying fervor from dawn until he collapsed at dusk, using the exhaustion of his muscles to silence the screaming in his soul. Awan watched him with a mixture of pride and fear. She saw the strong brother of her youth return, a man with purpose and direction. But she also saw that this purpose was fueled by darkness. Cain did not build with the joy of a creator. He built with the fury of a warrior fighting an invisible enemy. Are we building a home or a prison, Cain? Awan asked softly one evening as she watched the brick walls rise higher each day, obscuring the view of the valley. Cain set down the day's final brick, his voice hoarse with dust and fatigue. I am building a boundary, he said, a boundary between us and the emptiness out there. I am building a place where the silence of the sky cannot reach. The birth of their son, Enoch, added fuel to the fire of his ambition. The baby was a living contradiction. He was proof that life could spring from ashes, but he was also a fragile, vulnerable creature, exposed to the harsh world Cain had dragged him into. The love Cain felt for his son was fierce, but it was also full of fear. He looked into Enoch's clear eyes and swore that this child would never know the aimlessness or the sense of abandonment that he had. He would have a legacy, a kingdom. His name will be Enoch, Cain declared, his voice echoing among the unfinished walls. And this will be his city, a fortress to protect him from the chaos, a legacy to prove that we were here, that we existed. The city's name was not an honor, it was a claim of ownership. Cain was trying to build a future for his son, a future shielded from his own curse. He worked even harder, and his iron will attracted others, wandering groups, perhaps other lost descendants of Adam, came to the city of Enoch, drawn by the safety and order. Cain accepted them, not out of hospitality, but out of practicality. More hands meant the city grew faster. He became their leader, a silent, decisive ruler. He gave orders, assigned tasks, and settled disputes with a cold, impartial justice. The city of Enoch grew, an island of human order in a sea of natural chaos. Its foundations were made of brick, but the mortar that held them together was mixed with fear and despair. The city of Enoch was more than a collection of walls. It became a laboratory for human creativity when separated from the divine. Cain's descendants, born and raised in a world defined by will and necessity, developed extraordinary talents. They were pioneers, inventors, and artists, but all their achievements bore an unmistakable stamp an emptiness at their core. Tubal-Cain, a direct descendant, was the embodiment of material power. He was the one who tamed metal. In blazing forges, he transformed lifeless ore into molten bronze and glowing iron. It was a power akin to magic. From iron, he forged tools that changed the world. Iron plows broke the most stubborn soil. Iron axes felled the largest forests. The city of Enoch became wealthy and powerful, an oasis of prosperity in the barren land of Nod. But the power of iron was two-sided. Along with the plowshare, Tubal-Cain also forged a sword. Along with the builder's chisel, he forged the arrowhead. The power to create was also the power to destroy. Prosperity gave birth to greed. The city walls were no longer just for protection against wild beasts, but against envious neighbors. The civilization of Cain had learned to make weapons before it had learned to master its own anger. Meanwhile, Jubal, Tubal-Cain's brother, discovered a different kind of power. He was not captivated by the strength of metal, but by the mystery of sound. He was the one who heard the music hidden in a taut string or a hollow reed. He created the first harp with notes as clear as dewdrops, and the first flute with a melody as soaring as the wind. Jubal's music became the soul of Enoch. It was the solace after a hard day's labor, the joy in festivals, the language of love and sorrow. Awan, now an old woman, would often sit and listen quietly as Jubal played. His melodies were breathtakingly beautiful, his skill so great it seemed inhuman. But within that beauty, she always heard an undercurrent of longing, an unnameable sadness. The music of Abel, the long-dead shepherd, had been simple but filled with peace, like a quiet conversation with God. Jubal's music was different. It was complex, captivating, but it was the echo of a soul searching for something lost. It could touch the pain, but it could not heal it. It was the beauty of a flower grown in darkness, brilliant, but never having known the sun. This was the legacy of Cain's line, a legacy of genius without grace. They gave humanity the tools to master the physical world and the art to express the most complex emotions. But their tools were often stained with blood, and their art was always tinged with an infinite sorrow. They had proven that man could achieve great things without God, but they had also inadvertently proven that those achievements, however magnificent, could not fill the void his absence left behind. The civilization of iron and song was a civilization that was strong and sophisticated, but ultimately unredeemed. While the city of Enoch grew loud with ambition and innovation, another story, almost a whisper, was being written in the lands to the west. This was not a story of conquest, but of preservation. This was the story of the line of Seth. Seth's birth was not a victory, but a comfort. Eve, in her grief, saw in this son a continuation, an appointment to fill the space Abel had left. Seth grew up without Cain's fierce drive, but he had something else, a deep capacity for listening. He listened to his parents' stories of a world that was lost, and instead of feeling bitterness, he felt a responsibility to recover what had been forgotten. He found his companion in Azura, Awan's sister. If Awan was the symbol of active compassion, Azura was the embodiment of quiet faith. Together they formed a family whose foundation was not brick and stone, but memory and reverence. They taught their children not how to build walls, but how to look at the stars. They were not rulers, but keepers of memory, retelling the stories of creation, the fall, and the possibility of reconciliation. The fundamental difference between the two lines was expressed in one simple act. In the city of Enoch, men built monuments to their own achievements, but in the line of Seth, in the time of his son Enosh, they did something radically different. They began to call upon the name of the Lord. Imagine that moment. There was no pageantry. A small band of nomads, of shepherds, gathered under the vast night sky. They did not ask for bountiful harvests or victory in battle. They simply acknowledged their own smallness in the face of the universe. They called upon a name with whom their ancestors had once walked in intimate conversation. It was an act of pure faith, an attempt to reconnect a broken cord. In the silence of the universe, they lit a quiet flame. That flame, however small, was answered. From this line came individuals who had a special connection to the divine. There was Enoch, who walked with God so intimately that he bypassed death itself. There was Methuselah, who lived for nearly a millennium, a living bridge between generations. And eventually there was Noah, who was chosen for his righteousness to preserve life when the world was cleansed by water. The legacy of Seth and Azura was not in visible structures or works of art. Their legacy was an invisible current of faith passed down from generation to generation through prayers by the fireside and stories told under the stars. It was a silent counterpoint to Cain's material civilization. While one branch of humanity was trying to build a tower tall enough to reach the heavens, the other was learning to kneel in humility. One sought power, the other sought presence. One was the roar of iron, the other was the quiet flame that would never be extinguished. The history of humanity, after that first fracture, became the story of two parallel paths, the path of the shadow and the path of the echo. The shadow was cast by the city of Enoch. It was tangible, dark, and ever-expanding. It was the civilization of Cain, a civilization of measurable achievements. The shadow of its walls stretched across the land, offering security, but also obscuring the light. The shadows of its smiths fell across their forges, creating tools of great power, but also of great potential violence. This was a world of what and how much. A person's worth was determined by what they owned and what they could do. They were the pragmatists, the builders, who believed in the power of human hands and human intellect. They looked forward, always seeking innovation, progress, and a greater future of their own making. To them, the past was a series of mistakes to be overcome, and the divine was a vague concept that had lost its relevance. The echo, in contrast, was the legacy of the line of Seth. It was invisible, subtle, and required one to listen. It was not a civilization of structures, but of traditions. They did not seek to cast their own shadow, but to listen for the echo of a truth that was already there. Their lives were an attempt to replicate a lost harmony. A person's worth was determined by why and how. Why are we here? How should we live? They were the contemplatives, the preservers, who believed in the power of the heart and the soul. They looked backward, not to regret, but to learn from memory. To them, the past was a source of wisdom, and the divine was a living reality, even if it could sometimes only be perceived through faith. These two paths, though seemingly separate, constantly interacted within the soul of humanity itself. The shadow craved stability and power, but always felt an emptiness that no material achievement could fill. The echo offered peace and meaning, but sometimes lacked the drive to change and improve the tangible world. Sometimes the two worlds would touch. A merchant from the city of Enoch, searching for new ores, might stumble upon a camp of Seth's descendants. He might scoff at their simplicity, but in a quiet moment, he might feel a pang of envy for a peace he had never known. Conversely, a young shepherd from the line of Seth, hearing tales of the magnificent city of Enoch, might feel a sense of curiosity, a longing for a life of more excitement and challenge. The shadow and the echo, action and contemplation, self-reliance and trust. These were the two poles of human existence, set in place at the dawn of time by the brothers. Subsequent history would be an endless struggle between these two forces, not just between nations or civilizations, but within the heart of every single individual. Each person, in their own way, had to choose which path to walk, the path of casting one's own shadow, or the path of listening for the echo of eternity. The years flowed by like a river, carrying with them generations and memories. Awan outlived Cain and even her first grandchildren. She became a part of the city of Enoch itself, a living icon, a matriarch who was respected but never truly understood. From the balcony of her home, she watched the city transform, the walls growing ever higher, the sounds growing ever louder, and the silence in the human soul growing ever deeper. She never forgot why she had left. She had not stepped into the darkness to share Cain's sin, but to share his solitude. She had failed to save his soul. Cain died as he had lived, a powerful king surrounded by people but utterly alone, forever imprisoned by his internal mark. But as she looked back on her long journey, Awan realized that the purpose of an act is not always found in its outcome. She may not have saved Cain, but she had saved something else, the idea of compassion in a world that knew only justice and punishment. Her choice had become a quiet legend, a story told by firesides, not as a doctrine, but as a question. When all is lost, what do we owe one another? That question, her whisper, had planted a seed of grace in a land unfamiliar with it. That seed sprouted in the most unlikely places. It sprouted in the heart of a smith who used his skills not to forge swords, but to create tools that lessened his neighbor's burden. It sprouted in the heart of a musician who composed a melody not just to express his sorrow, but to bring comfort. It sprouted in the actions of a mother who taught her child about sharing, even when the society around her taught only of accumulation. This was Awan's true legacy. It was not a city or a lineage. It was a possibility. The possibility that even in a civilization built on pride and separation from God, love could find a crack in which to take root. It was an invisible counterweight to Cain's tangible legacy. If Cain had taught humanity how to build, Awan had taught them a much harder lesson: how to care. One evening, as the last rays of her life's sun fell upon her wrinkled face, Awan smiled. She had lived a full life. She did not see glory in the city walls, nor did she hear greatness in the clang of hammers. Instead, she saw value in the small acts of kindness, the glimmers of humanity in the darkness of ambition. She had been the one who brought a single candle into a dark room. The candle may not have dispelled all the darkness, but it had proven that the darkness was not absolute. Her whisper had become immortal, an echo of grace that would forever sound alongside the echo of sin, a reminder that even after the worst of fractures, there is always room for a new beginning, not by rebuilding what was lost, but by planting something entirely new in the ashes.